Section 16 of Recollections of a Busy Life by William B. Forwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. Philanthropy, Charitable and Social Work. In no department of Liverpool life has more distinct progress been made than in its social regeneration. Liverpool has always been liberal and generous in her charities, but there was an absence of enlightenment in her municipal administration, and an utter failure to realize the social degradation in which so many of her people lived. Her streets in the 60s were not fit places for respectable people after dark, while the neighborhood of the Sailors' Home, at all times of the day, was a place to be avoided. Liverpool was known as the Black Spot on the Mersey, and well earned that title. It is difficult to make people sober or moral by Act of Parliament, and the Liverpool people did not wait for Parliament, but aroused and set in motion a strong public opinion, which demanded radical social changes. The town had been flooded with licensed public houses at a time when Mr. J. R. Jeffrey, Mr. Robertson Gladstone, and other justices advocated the free license system, and the increased competition in the sale of drink had led to many evils. The justices thought that by extending licenses they would do away with what was called the gin palace, as it would no longer be worth the publican's while to invest large sums of money to make his house attractive and alluring. The multiplicity of licenses, however, increased intemperance to such an extent that in 1874 things were so bad that the Times commented on the dreadful moral condition of Liverpool, and its unparalleled death rate, as indicating that, quote, "the leading inhabitants were negligent of their duties as citizens." Unquote. The public conscience was aroused, and a band of very earnest temperance men, headed by Mr. Alexander Balfour, the Rev. Dr. Lundy, and Mr. Sam Smith, began a crusade against the licensing justices and the watch committee, whom they considered to be sympathetic with the drink trade, and a vigilance committee was formed. The struggle was a long and fierce one, but great reforms have taken place. The streets of Liverpool have been purified, and the temptations to drink have been largely reduced. The name of Alexander Balfour will ever stand out prominently as the chief of this movement in the days when strong men were wanted to lead, and in these latter days Sir Thomas Hughes is entitled to much credit for the firm and consistent manner he has ruled over the licensing bench. Liverpool now breathes freely and is no longer the black spot on the Mersey. Throughout this long and angry controversy the Conservative Party occupied a difficult position. Many of its most active supporters were connected with what is termed the trade. They were endeavoring to conduct a very difficult business respectably and in conformity with the licensing laws. They have also been called upon to make large sacrifices. The Conservative Party were always sympathetic with the trade, and felt that the measures meted out to them were unduly harsh, but have always recognized that something heroic must be done to win back the city's good name. It is regrettable that a great and much needed social reform should have become so much mixed up with party politics, but under the circumstances it was perhaps unavoidable. The reforms which have taken place owe much of their success to our press. Porcupine, in the 70s, under the editorship of Hugh Shimmin, was their active and strong advocate, and more recently the Daily Post, under the direction of Sir Edward Russell, has also done good service, and, sad to say, both editors had to appear in the law court to vindicate their actions. While this movement to exercise increased supervision over public houses and to diminish their number was in progress, the City Council was actively engaged in the problem of not merely demolishing insanitary property, but of replacing the rookeries thus destroyed by suitable and well-designed houses. This new policy began in 1885, when the group of dwellings known as Victoria Square was erected. This good work has proceeded rapidly, and the corporation has already expended considerably over £1,000,000 in this direction. Perhaps no one obtains such a full insight into the charitable and philanthropic work of the city as the Lord Mayor. He is called upon to preside over annual meetings of some 90 of our charities, and is brought into close contact with many smaller societies, doing what they can for bettering and brightening the lives of the people. Whatever may have been the shortcomings of Liverpool in other respects, her people have always liberally supported her charities, and these have been far-reaching and generous in the benefits they have conferred upon the community. In the wide realm of philanthropy, Liverpool has had many active workers, for the most part unknown to fame, who plod away day after day in our slums, with no prospect of reward, save the satisfaction of doing something to ameliorate and brighten the lives of others. Recently, a short paragraph in a newspaper told us of the death of a clergyman who had a distinguished university career, and who for 24 years lived and worked unknown in the byways of Liverpool, attached to no church, but doing what he could to uplift those around him. And there are many such. Among our workers in the good cause of philanthropy we have had Mr. Edward Whitley, M.P., Mr. Clark Aspinall, Mr. Christopher Bushell, Mr. William Rathbone, M.P., Mr. William Crosfield, Mr. Charles Langton, Canon Major Lester, and Monsignor Nugent. Mr. William Rathbone was not only an ideal local member of Parliament, but for more than half a century he was foremost in every good work in Liverpool. As a member of the Select Vestry, he made the Poor Laws a special subject of study. In the founding of our university and the District Nursing Association, the first in the country, Mr. Rathbone rendered a great service. Mr. Christopher Bushell was another leader of men. Tall and dignified in appearance, and a good speaker, he was active in the cause of philanthropy in support of the Church and of education. Nor must we forget the many ladies who have devoted their energies to charitable and philanthropic work. Miss Calder has accomplished great things for the School of Cookery, and we have Miss Melly and Miss Rathbone working for the Curl Society. The late Countess of Latham was ever ready with her handsome and distinguished presence and eloquent voice to help forward every good work. Only a few months before she met with her sad and tragic death, she said to me, "When I am gone, you must write as my epitaph, 'She opened bazaars.'" Liverpool has had few friends more devoted or more capable than the late Lady Latham. Chapter 16. The Seamen's Orphanage, etc. On the death of Mr. Alfred Turner in 1896, I was made president of the Seamen's Orphanage. The detail work of the institution is carried on by the chairman of the committee. The first chairman was Mr. Robert Allen, whose devotion to the interests of the institution was beyond all praise. On his retirement his place was filled by Mr. J. H. Beazley, one of the sons of the founder, the late James Beazley. No institution in the city of Liverpool is doing a better or a nobler work. We can all realize how much our safety and how greatly our prosperity as a nation depend upon our sailors, yet we scarcely appreciate how little chance a sailor has of saving money for a rainy day, and how entirely dependent his widow and family generally are upon public support. The institution is worked upon right lines. A high moral and religious tone is inculcated, and the children are brought up to be good Christian boys and girls and to take a pride in their school. I do not know anything more refreshing than to visit the school, with its hundreds of bright, joyous children, all so glad to make you welcome with their cheery "Good morning, sir." Our anniversary Sunday is a red letter day in the institution, the sermon being preached by a bishop. After the service an inspection of the institution is made. It has been my privilege to entertain the bishops during their visit, and we have had staying with us the Bishops of Carlisle, Hereford, Bangor, Sodor and Man, Manchester, and the Archbishop of York. The Royal Commission on Motors. The advent of the motor vehicle, driven by an internal combustion engine, was remarkable for its suddenness and its rapid development. The motor was only in the experimental stage in 1896, yet 4 years later several thousand were on the roads, and this number increased in another 5 years to 60,000. That vehicles should be driven along the public highways at 30 and 40 and even 50 miles an hour was subversive to all ideas of what was prudent and safe, and when these vehicles set up clouds of dust in their progress, there was a public outcry. This was fully justified, for the speed at which motors were driven was undoubtedly excessive. On the other hand, the public did not realize the complete control which the drivers could exercise, even at high speeds. The government, in response to the popular demand in 1905, appointed a Royal Commission on Motors, of which I was nominated a member. Viscount Selby was appointed the chairman, and the other members were the Marquis of Winchester, Sir Edward Henry, Chief of the Metropolitan Police, Sir David Harrell, K.C.B., and Mr. Munro, C.B., of the Local Government Board. We held about 50 sittings, extending over a year, and examined over 60 witnesses, representing the highway authorities, the various motor clubs and manufacturers, and a large number of persons who were opposed to the use of motors on the high roads, unless limited to a low rate of speed. The enquiry was interesting and instructive. It brought out the fact that much as many people object to motors, they one and all agreed that they had come to stay. It was also proved that since railways had withdrawn the heavy traffic from the highways, the roads had been allowed to fall into poor condition, and to this could be attributed some part of the complaints as to dust. I was personally in favour of limiting the speed to 25 miles an hour in the open, and 10 miles through towns and villages, but as all the other members of the Commission felt that in the open country we should rely upon the powers of the present Highway Act, which makes it a serious offence to drive at a speed causing danger to the public, and were in favour of a no speed limit except through villages, I gave way, so that our report might be a unanimous report. We made a long list of recommendations for the better regulation of motor traffic. I am glad to say our report was well received, and although no bill has been introduced to give legal force to its recommendations, they are being very generally acted upon. I have often since regretted that I did not press my recommendation restricting the speed in the open to 25 miles an hour, as I feel it would have largely solved the speed question. The powers under the Highway Act would still have remained, compelling motors to drive at all times, with due regard to public safety. Chapter 17. The Earl of Derby. Appointments to the County Bench. I was brought into such frequent contact with the late Lord Derby, in connection with my duties as chairman of Quarter Sessions, that I should like to add a few words of appreciation of his lordship's great kindness and consideration. I must, however, in order to make my story quite clear, preface my remarks by a reference to the late Earl of Sefton, who was the Lord Lieutenant of Lancashire for so many years. Lord Sefton in his appointments to the bench took an infinite amount of trouble to select good men, and men who when appointed would do their work. He was good enough frequently to consult me, and I certainly did my best to support him in his choice of suitable men for the office of magistrate, which I hold to be a position of importance and responsibility. It is not generally recognized that magistrates are endowed with a very great power over the liberties of the people, and they ought therefore to be selected with great care. Two magistrates sitting at petty sessions have in a sense more power than a judge sitting at an assize. They not only determine the guilt of the prisoner, but can and do impose considerable terms of imprisonment. At the assizes the jury decide if the prisoner is guilty, the judge only awards the punishment. Lord Sefton unfortunately made a mistake in some of his appointments to the Salford division. He was, however, entirely free from blame. Erroneous information was given to him, and he made, quite unawares, some political appointments. He added to the bench the names of several Conservative politicians, which gave great offence to the Liberal government then in power. Mr. Bryce, then Chancellor of the Duchy, wished to rectify the mistake by insisting upon Lord Sefton appointing a number of active Liberals. This he declined to do, and it led to a deadlock. Lord Sefton threatened to resign, and he would have done so had we not been able to build a bridge over which both he and the Chancellor were able to retire without loss of dignity. I was much helped in these negotiations by my friend, the late Mr. Robert D. Holt. Upon Lord Sefton's death, Lord Derby was appointed the Lord Lieutenant. Naturally a timid man, he was very anxious to avoid the mistake made by his predecessor, and for several years he created no new magistrates in some petty sessional divisions, and the administration of justice was rendered most difficult through the lack of justices. I was at this time frequently at Knowsley, and spent several hours in going over the lists of names with his lordship, and always came away with a promise that some appointments should be made forthwith, but still he hesitated. It was quite impossible to feel disappointed. Lord Derby was always so courteous and kind, and one could not help feeling that his hesitation arose from his extreme conscientiousness and high sense of duty, and also one could not fail to recognize that his task was delicate and difficult. When the Liberal government came into office in 1905, they set about to adjust the inequality between the political parties as represented on the bench, and the Lord Chancellor practically made all the appointments, the Lord Lieutenant merely confirming. Under this arrangement the bench in Lancashire has been greatly increased, but I doubt if its status has been maintained. Lord and Lady Derby from time to time extended great kindness to us, Lady Derby frequently inviting us to dine and sleep at Knowsley, to meet her distinguished guests. In this way we had the opportunity of meeting the Prince and Princess of Wales, the Lord Chancellor, Lord Halsbury, the Prime Minister, Mr. Balfour, and others. The hospitality of Knowsley is proverbial. Lord and Lady Derby were ideal host and hostess, and we have paid no pleasanter visits than those to Knowsley. When Lord Derby was elected Lord Mayor of Liverpool, I was asked to act as his deputy, as it was not expected that his lordship would do more than the formal and official work. For some time I called at the town hall every morning to see if I could be of any service, but I quickly discovered that Lord Derby was not going to discharge his duties in a perfunctory manner, and my services were required very little. I remember on one of my visits his lordship telling me his horse was the favourite for the Oaks, which was going to be run on the day following. I begged him to go up to see the race, but he replied his first duty was at the town hall. The race was run, and Lord Derby's horse won. I often narrated this episode as a proof of his lordship's devotion to his duties, and once in his presence, when he intervened and said, "Do not give me too much credit. I must confess the temptation to see my horse win was too strong for me. I went up by the midnight train, and returned by the first train after the race. Lord Derby proved a most excellent Lord Mayor, and the debates in the Council were never before, and have never since been, conducted with so much decorum and dignity. The hospitality of the Town Hall was maintained on a splendid scale. Lady Derby took a keen personal interest in all the arrangements, and her own charming personality contributed greatly to the popularity and success of his lordship's year of office, which I have also reason to believe he greatly enjoyed. It may be interesting to narrate how Lord Derby became Lord Mayor. I had heard it stated that his brother and predecessor in the title had often expressed his wish that the old tradition of the family might be revived, and that he might be asked to become Mayor of Liverpool, and bearing this in mind I ventured one day to mention the subject to Lord Stanley. I found it not only interested him greatly, but he said he was sure his father would appreciate the honour, provided it was the unanimous wish of the Council. I mentioned the matter to our leader in the Council, and an early opportunity was availed of to elect Lord Derby as the first Lord Mayor of the extended Liverpool. By the death of Lord Derby, Liverpool sustained a grievous loss. He had filled many great public positions: Governor-General of Canada, Secretary of State for War, but in no position did he do more useful work than in the management of his own vast estates, and in furthering good work of every description round and about Liverpool. He fully realised that great responsibility attached to his position, and he devoted himself to the discharge of his many duties in the county and in Liverpool with an assiduity and earnestness which won the admiration of all, while all were fascinated by his great courtesy and old-world charm of manner. Lord Derby took a deep and active interest in the building of the cathedral, always making a point of attending our meetings when in Liverpool, and his encouragement and wise words of advice were most helpful. Prince Fushimi of Japan. In June 1907 I received a letter from Sir Edward Grey, the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, asking me if I could entertain at Bromborough Hall the Prince Fushimi of Japan, a royal prince, who was visiting England on a special mission from the Emperor. I replied that while I should be delighted to do all I could to extend hospitality to the prince, I could only place 10 bedrooms at his disposal. Sir Edward Grey replied that as the suite comprised 22, he had asked Lord Derby to invite the Prince to Knowsley, but would be glad if I would make the necessary arrangements for his visit to Liverpool. This was followed by a letter from Lord Derby asking me to send to his comptroller a list of the guests I thought he ought to invite, intimating that he could put up 30 and dine 40 all told. I made out a purely official list, and arranged for the Lord Mayor to give the Prince a luncheon at the Town Hall, and for the Dock Board to take him in their tender for a sail on the river, and afterwards to proceed to Knowsley. The suite in attendance on the Prince was most distinguished, including the Grand Chamberlain to the Emperor, the Admiral who had been Minister of Marine during the Russo-Japanese War, the General who commanded the cavalry during the war, and many other men of eminence. They mostly spoke English, and were very interesting. They were charmed with the park at Knowsley, and were familiar with the history of many of the great personages whose portraits were displayed upon the walls of the Knowsley dining room. They asked innumerable questions, and among other things wanted a plan of Knowsley. The only plan Lord Derby could produce was a plan made to show the drainage system. Strange to say, they were delighted with it. The following morning, shortly before leaving, the Prince came downstairs, preceded by 2 of his suite, bearing a beautiful cabinet, which he placed at Lady Derby's feet, a present from the Emperor. Lady Derby was much gratified, and said she was more than repaid for all the trouble she had taken in opening the house and bringing all the servants, carriages, and horses from London, adding, "They are such perfect gentlemen." Knowsley was in the hands of the painters, and being in the middle of the London season, it was not an easy thing to arrange to entertain the Prince. But as the King had expressed a wish that Lady Derby should be his host, it had to be done. Liverpool had a good friend in the late Lord Derby, and no one will ever know the trouble he took to entertain royal and distinguished visitors to Liverpool, oftentimes at considerable personal inconvenience. During the war between Russia and Japan, it was for long a question if the fleet of Japan would be strong enough to meet the Russian fleet. At the close of the war, it came out for the first time that the most powerful ship in the Japanese fleet had in the early days of the war been blown up by a mine, with the loss of 800 lives. I ventured to ask the Minister of Marine how they managed to keep the secret so well. He simply replied, "Our people are very patriotic." I also asked the general who was in command of the cavalry how it was that their great strategical movements did not leak out. He answered with a twinkle in his eye, "The newspaper gentlemen were very pleasant, and we managed to interest and amuse them elsewhere." End of section 16.